Well, good evening and welcome to the show where conservative is cool and woke is a joke, and where earlier this evening Peter Dutton presented his first budget in reply. As far as I'm concerned, it was a 7 out of 10 performance. Quite rightly, Peter Dutton built his reply around the bad decisions of Labor and how this is driving up energy prices. It was brilliant of him to compare how much electricity prices always rise more under Labor. They did under Rudd, and they are doing so again now, at the same time as Labor is handing out tens of millions of dollars in funding for climate and Indigenous whatnots, let alone hundreds of millions of dollars for transmission cables for renewables technologies, some of which don't yet exist. As the opposition leader pointed out, every dollar spent on transmission cables will be paid for by you, the consumers, and Labor's 56% power hike is just the beginning. Meanwhile, Labor is planning to splurge on 20,000 extra public servants, to study diversity and inclusion, no doubt, please. And as I shall explain in a moment, it was absolutely correct of Peter Dutton to compare our plight to that of Europe and their catastrophic energy decisions, including how Chris Bowen's climate policies will guarantee the loss of Australian jobs and sovereign capabilities. And then, superbly, Peter Dutton listed all the countries investing in small modular nuclear energies. The bottom line, however, is inescapable. As Dutton says, the typical Aussie family will be $2,000 worse off under Labor. It was a very good speech, but it could have been even better. Rather than saying the coalition is seeking an intelligent conversation on nuclear, whatever that means, Peter Dutton should have committed the next coalition government unequivocally to nuclear power, and he should have abolished the whole net zero nonsense. Instead, he started banging on about a sustainable future. Honestly, I told you, Mr Dutton, sir, stop listening to Simon Birmingham if you want to win the next election. But as I said, mainly a very, very good speech and a very good performance. Peter Dutton spelled out that the coalition believes in a core principle: lower taxes, yes. And he had a great line: when Labor want more money, they come after yours. And finally, a big tick for announcing that the Liberals would allow first home buyers to access their super, to buy their first home. And half a tick for admitting that state government lockdowns went on far too long. No wonder Scott Morrison was looking a little bit shifty in his seat on the backbench around about that point. Still, 7 out of 10, not bad. Speaking of Scott Morrison, Simon Birmingham, Dave Sharma, Tim Wilson, and all the other bedwetting Liberals, had they not betrayed the people of the nation by treacherously signing us up to net zero, then Peter Dutton and Angus Taylor would be in a much better position to attack the Labor Party and point out how disastrous their net zero emissions policies are and will prove to be for this nation. Now, I want you to think carefully about the major logic flaw in Labor's excuse during the budget for soaring energy prices. You and I know it's because of the insanity of heading down the net zero path, which began with Scott Morrison but is being accelerated under Chris Bowen and Labor. But since forming government, Labor has run this line about how it's Europe's energy problems and the war in Ukraine. Indeed, this is why they are having problems. They're blaming it all on the war in Ukraine. Chris Bowen and Labor also maintain that had the coalition embraced the policies, the net zero policies that they are now embracing a decade ago, they're talking about this squandered decade, well, they claim we wouldn't be in the mess we are currently in. Okay, so let's give them, Labor, the benefit of the doubt on both those points. And let's say that it's the war in Ukraine, which could go on for years, by the way, which is responsible for our soaring energy prices. And let's say that had Labor been in power with its net zero transition policies a decade ago, we would be in a much better, healthier position now. Okay, let's just play this fantasy. Furthermore, Chris Bowen maintains that the only way ahead is for Australia to dramatically increase its transition to renewables. So, to test this proposition, I am going to conduct a small test. What I need is, in scientific terminology, called a control group. For the purposes of this experiment, I shall call my control group Bowenland, named, of course, in honour of that great climate crusader and genius, Chris Bowen. Ideally, Bowenland is a country that did embark on net zero energy policies at least a decade ago, and Bowenland is also one that is clearly and unequivocally impacted by the Ukrainian war. Having found my control group, or I might even find more than one control group, there might be a couple more out there. I then must complete my scientific experiment in the time-honoured method of asking probing questions. Namely, is Bowenland now frantically completing the task of shutting down all her coal-fired power plants? Is Bowenland frantically adding the final touches to ensure renewables make up over 80% of their energy mix, as Chris Bowen insists is the only way forward? Is Bowenland ignoring nuclear because it's way too expensive and takes too long to develop, as Chris Bowen insists? And is Bowenland getting out of fossil fuels altogether, as Chris Bowen insists we must? And finally, is Bowenland pouring millions of dollars of taxpayers' funds into green hydrogen hubs, giant lithium batteries dotted around the landscape, and pushing water uphill, as Chris Bowen insists we must? No, they are not. In fact, they are doing the complete opposite. You see, Germany is Bowenland. So too is Sweden, in fact. Both are, of course, right on the doorstep of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Both have been pursuing extreme climate change policies for well over a decade under governments with heavy left-wing Greens credentials and components. Germany is indeed one of the world's leading practitioners of renewables. Germany launched its Energiewende policy, or energy turnaround policy, all the way back in 2010, when, by the way, Chris Bowen was still in political nappies as the most hopeless immigration minister this nation has ever seen. Back then, the Bowenland government, the German government, promised the complete phasing out of nuclear power by, well, 2022, and a dramatic reduction in greenhouse emissions. So, how's it all going then for the good burghers of Bowenland? Not so good. Let me translate. This week, the German government announced it could run out of gas by February, smack bang in the middle of a freezing winter. Quote, Germany could be completely out of gas by February, the country's gas agency has said, with some experts saying that the country needs to cut consumption by 30% to make it through the crisis intact. But it gets better, or rather, it gets worse for our control group. So bad, indeed, is the energy crisis in Bowenland, Germany, that citizens who can no longer afford their energy bills have been forced to sneak out at night and rummage through the forests, cutting down branches for their winter fuel. In desperation, the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has decreed that the last 3 German nuclear power plants, which were supposed to be shut down at the end of this year, will now remain open until at least next year, in a panic move that's got the Greens all upset, of course. His finance minister, Christian Lindner, was jubilant. The continued use of the Emsland nuclear power plant is an important contribution to grid stability, electricity costs, and climate protection, he said on Twitter. And yet, even that is not enough. Remember, this is our control group, where climate change policies of the sort favoured by Chris Bowen have been in place for well over a decade. No squandering there. This week, we also learnt that in Bowenland, Germany, they are frantically dismantling a wind farm because it is sitting on top of a new coal mine they desperately need to expand. Yes, that's right. Commenting on the dismantling of wind turbines to make way for expanding a coal mine. Guido Stephan, a spokesperson for the company, told The Guardian, quote, "We realise this comes across as paradoxical." Yes, you can say that again, Guido. "But that is as matters stand." Yes, that's Guido Stephan. Name rings a bell. I wonder if he's related to our very own Will Stephan, Tim Flannery's buddy at the Climate Council. Speaking of Tim Flannery, here he is back in 2007, explaining how global warming is like a bowl of spaghetti, and if you happen to have a water view, you've only got a decade or so before you better run for the hills.
We all know that, if you heat a pot of spaghetti on the stove, it'll get more energetic. But scientists hadn't quite realised how much more energetic the atmosphere would get as we warmed it. We will be, in the next decade or so, if we're lucky enough to survive this period and get on the right track, we'll be working very, very hard to pull the gas out of the air. Because there's already far too much pollution in the air. James Hansen, who is the world's leading thinker in this area with the Goddard Institute of NASA, believes we're on the brink of triggering a 25-metre rise in sea level. So anyone with a coastal view from their bedroom window or kitchen window or wherever is likely to lose their house as a result of that change.
That was a decade and a half ago. But I digress. Back to our scientific experiment. Let's recap. In our control group of Bowenland, a climate-friendly net zero nation, in order to cope with rising energy prices caused mainly by the war in Ukraine, precisely the same situation we are faced with here, according to Jim Chalmers in his budget. In our control group, the citizens are sneaking into the forests at night in order to grab fuel to keep warm and cook with. The government is frantically stopping nuclear and coal-fired power plants from closing down, and energy companies are tearing down wind turbines in order to get their paws on the coal buried beneath them so they can mine it. Bowenland doesn't sound like such a great place to be in, after all. But why stick with one control group when there are plenty of others to choose from? Another country that is adjacent to Ukraine and Russia and has also been actively led by Green-style, progressive, anti-fossil fuel governments for well over a decade is Sweden, often described as the world's climate model country. Let's call it Gretaland for the purposes of our experiment. And what do we find in Gretaland? Are they increasing their renewables? Are they increasing their climate targets? Are they frantically recommitting to net zero? No. Much to the dismay of the Lovies and the Greens, the new Swedish government has cut right to the chase and has scrapped the entire Ministry for the Environment. Oh, and they're going to immediately get cracking on building new nuclear power plants as well. Oops! So there you have it. Labour maintains that it is the war in the Ukraine and a decade of not pursuing climate policies that has led Australia into soaring energy prices, up over 50%. If that is true, then by Labour's own logic, we should be copying those countries that did pursue net zero policies but are now suffering an energy crisis because of the war in Ukraine. We should be doing exactly what the control groups are doing. We should shut down our Ministry for Climate Change. Bye-bye, Bowen. We should be going nuclear as quickly as possible, and we should start tearing down our wind turbines so we can dig up more coal. But instead, we have a government going in the complete opposite direction. Somehow, I don't think this is going to end very well. Anyway, here's a typical young Australian of the sort who believes the climate nonsense peddled by Chris Bowen and Labor.
Farming needs to stop. That's the single biggest driver of climate change.
Remember, farmers, they'll be coming for you next, and then heaven help us all.